What happens when a United States aircraft carrier is sitting in the Arabian Sea, and all of a sudden, the world breaks out into war? With about 90 fighter aircraft aboard your typical carrier vessel, the commander might need to scramble every single fighter into the air at a moment's notice. In fact, this is known as an alpha strike, something the whole world dreads, but something that could affect the tide of a conflict. The question is, how quickly the Navy can deploy all jets from an aircraft, and exactly what this would mean for those facing the brunt of this force. And what about bad conditions? How does an aircraft carrier operate in the middle of a storm? The aircraft carrier is the most important vessel in the U.S. Navy. Not only does it cost a whopping $13 billion if you think of the USS Gerald R. Ford, or $7 billion when thinking of the Nimitz-class carriers, but it holds anywhere between 60 and 90 fighter jets at any given time. About 6,000 crew work tirelessly to ensure the carrier operates flawlessly and is always mission-ready whenever it is called upon by the Navy. Standing at almost 1,100 feet in length, with a 134-foot beam and a 250-foot flight deck, the aircraft carrier carries enough firepower to wipe out an entire city while traveling at about 30 knots. Aside from the size and intimidating visuals, these carriers not only carry jets, but also a lot of firepower, including things like the Sea Sparrow missiles, rolling airframe missiles, and the most notorious, Phalanx CIWS, designed to obliterate virtually anything that challenges it. Moreover, a carrier never travels alone, being surrounded by a group of destroyers, a tanker, submarines, and various other vessels that combine to make a carrier strike group. At the time of this video, the USS Carl Vinson is currently such a strike group operating from within the Arabian Sea. But every day aboard this vessel can be challenging and hard work for the sailors who make things happen. You see, aside from launching fighter jets and keeping the vessel afloat, the aircraft carrier is literally a city at sea. Sailors need to live aboard the vessel for months on end, with only a few amenities, while being in a constant state of readiness. But the moment something happens, an aircraft carrier needs to be ready. And if things get really out of hand, the Navy might need to rely on what is called an alpha strike. Coined during the Vietnam War, the term alpha strike refers to a deckload of aircraft launched one after the other. In fact, it means that a carrier will launch every single jet it can house on the flight deck in one swift motion. While many believe it refers to launching every single vessel aboard, which might have been possible during the Vietnam War, modern carriers have so many aircraft that they need to store half of them below the deck. Essentially, an alpha strike in modern terms refers to the carrier launching about half its air fleet in one go. Should an alpha strike be called, sailors will go to their battle stations, where every person aboard the flight deck will need to be ready. This includes having a ready deck that can receive aircraft coming into land after sustaining battle damage. On the other hand, traditional carriers usually operate with what is known as cyclic operations, where a carrier will launch and recover aircraft on a prescribed schedule. In layman's terms, it means that the aircraft aboard will be cycled, with only a few of them being launched, while others are recovered. During the Vietnam War, such a cycle typically lasted about 90 minutes, and a carrier can, in times of war, go through about 9 of these cycles in 13 hours. Given the length of deployment for an aircraft carrier during the Vietnam War, a sailor might witness between 9,000 and 13,000 sorties over their deployment, especially at the height of the war. But more important was the fact that these carriers didn't operate alone and would often be assisted by the Air Force. For example, a typical strike operation would involve sending the Air Force or Navy to strike the target first, and then 15 minutes later, another sortie would be flown to strike the target a second time. This doesn't happen nowadays. With technology like the B-2 Spirit and its capability of carrying 2 GBU-57 bunker buster bombs, a single sortie could be enough to deliver devastating damage to enemies. However, the alpha strike still exists today, and now refers to the moment when a carrier deploys every bit of firepower it has in a coordinated motion that is directed at a single target. However, it can also be directed at several targets, but the objective remains the same. In fact, the main objective is to hit the enemy with overwhelming force, which completely destroys the target, or at least establishes total air superiority, which should force the enemy into surrender. But as mentioned, things have changed significantly since the days of the Vietnam War, and where such a strike was typically done to focus on air-to-air combat and allow pilots to use specific tactics that would give them complete control of the enemy skies. It is no longer needed. So, before we look at a modern Alpha Strike and how it would apply to modern combat situations, it is important to look at why this never or rarely happens, especially in the United States. It is also the perfect opportunity for you to subscribe to our channel and make sure you understand the basics of naval warfare in the 21st century. As we alluded to earlier, the Alpha Strike is not something the US will use in modern warfare. We will look at a couple of situations later that might demand it, but for the most part, an Alpha Strike is not something that will happen very often. First of all, the United States has the most powerful air force in the world. This doesn't even begin to cover the contingent of air wings that make up part of the Navy. Moreover, modern US technology means that the current crop of fighter jets is basically unrivaled in the sky. When the US launches the F-22 Raptor or the F-35 Lightning II, no other nation in the world can even come close to shooting these down. In fact, Israel has shown how these US-made fifth-generation fighters can operate with impunity over the skies of Tehran, with the S-300 surface-to-air missile sites not even playing any part in the defense. On top of this, flight combinations that include things like the Growler and FA-18 Super Hornets form a formidable team that not only leads to clear and concise strikes, but also helps in jamming whatever it is the enemies can throw at them. This means that there is no real risk for US forces, and there is no need to deploy an Alpha Strike and risk things going wrong on the flight deck. The United States operates some of the most advanced weapons in the world, which will naturally give them control over the skies. So, essentially, it is all about technology, and despite having rivals, none of these have managed to come close to what the United States can put on the table. Perhaps a conflict with another global superpower such as China and Russia might once again force the United States into considering the Alpha Strike. For now, the Alpha Strike in conflict zones such as Iran and the Middle East doesn't seem likely. But what happens during an Alpha Strike? First of all, a mission commander needs to be notified, and this order usually comes from those higher up on the chain of command and potentially even admirals operating from Washington. An Alpha Strike is not something called that happens at a moment's notice. It takes days of planning and strategy to ensure that no sailor or piece of military equipment trips over one another. It can be seen as a game of Tetris, but instead of building blocks on the flight deck, billions of dollars of military equipment is moved around in a perfectly coordinated dance. Each person is ordered to their battle station, and the coordination needs to be carried out in a precise manner that keeps every person safe. Moreover, intelligence sources play a vital role in gathering information, not only pertaining to the mission, but also exactly what the level of force that will be needed to successfully complete the mission. This is also fed back to the CO aboard the vessel, who works hand in hand with the mission coordinator to plan how the mission will proceed. It can take another 24 hours to gather the information and plan the mission before anything happens. A meeting will be called with all those involved, including the air wing, where everyone is briefed precisely on what they need to do and what their responsibilities will be when carrying out this mission. The mission starts when a helmsman steers the carrier into the wind. This is purposely done to allow more airspeed over the wings that generate lift and ensure the jet can comfortably get airborne from the short runway it takes off from. By this time, the maintenance team has already been in action, making sure that every aircraft is ready for launch. One small little fact many people don't know is that aircraft are usually stored below the deck without any fuel or ordnance. Yes, Each jet needs to be fueled moments before it takes off. This is just a precautionary measure to ensure that the jet doesn't catch fire, or should the carrier move over the rough waves of the ocean, it doesn't accidentally set off a bunker buster bomb that could fire a hole into the hull of the vessel. Moreover, the maintenance team needs to check the aircraft each day when landing and when it is launched to ensure that any possibility of damage is assessed and reported to be repaired. But once these jets have been given the all-clear and all the ordnance has been fixed to the hard points, it is time for the real fun to begin. But once again, it is not as simple as just taking off from the flight deck. In fact, the next step hinges on the catapult operators and aircraft directors. These crewmen rarely get any credit, but they are the lifeblood of the flight deck, and it is up to them to ensure perfect coordination and avoid anything that could possibly go wrong. And it is not like they can take their time to decide whether or not something is working. This whole process is one massive race against time. The jets need to get into the air as soon as possible and be ready for action. Aircraft directors, those guys with the luminous wands, will guide each aircraft to the specific catapult. Yes, most US carriers still rely on a gas-powered catapult system, whereas the newer Gerald R. Ford class makes use of an electromagnetic system that cuts down on costs and speeds up the process. Nevertheless, the steam catapult system is still highly efficient, and it enables the Navy to launch up to 4 aircraft per minute. This means that a full complement can be launched in just under 20 minutes. Yes, the US Navy can dump every single jet into the sky in under 20 minutes, meaning that 90 fighter jets will be en route to its target almost immediately. One of the best examples of this is Operation Linebacker II, which happened during the Vietnam War and saw the US Navy launch 129 aircraft into the sky in just under 1 hour. This was one of the biggest shows of US power in history, and enough to virtually overwhelm almost any enemy that stood in the way. But this is under normal conditions, where the seas are calm and everything is going according to plan. Usually, this isn't the case, and there is always at least one kind of variable that will make launching these aircraft hard. For example, rough seas, and even rain. So, how does the Navy counteract this? One of the most fascinating questions is how aircraft carriers operate in bad weather conditions. In fact, there are a ton of questions that we think need to be addressed. One of the main benefits of an aircraft carrier is the high freeboard, often exceeding 65 feet. This means that even though seas become rough and waves almost crest the flight deck, it doesn't ever hinder operations. But will the Navy perform an alpha strike in these conditions? Well, the answer to this question is no. You see, an alpha strike has a lot of moving pieces, including hundreds of sailors who work aboard the deck to ensure that coordination happens smoothly. While the jets themselves are impervious to these conditions, it could potentially make it harder to move assets around and ensure that each catapult operates in optimal condition. This doesn't mean that no aircraft can be launched in treacherous conditions, but the number of jets that do get launched is much lower compared to sunny and clear sky conditions. Moreover, the lower visibility and higher waves also pose a significant risk for pilots, who need to rely on their instruments to get the aircraft in the air. But if you'd like to see a complete video on how these carriers overcome bad weather conditions, make sure to let us know in the comments below. So, what about landing? How do these aircraft land when it comes to an alpha strike? While it is great to have 90 fighters in the air, these all have a limited range and a limited amount of fuel. Once a fighter has completed their sortie, things can get a little more complicated, and this is where the true skill of these pilots and flight coordinators is on full display. Unlike the sequence of launching 4 jets every minute, landing is a little more complicated, and it is only possible for one to land at a time. This means that coordinators will need to remain in constant communication with pilots to tell them when and where to land. When it comes to landing, everyone needs to scramble to their battle stations to once again ensure that it happens in a smooth motion. As the jet comes to land, it is usually caught by a net. Then, the flight directors will once again guide the pilot to where the jet needs to be stopped. The pilot will steer the jet to the designated position, where it is usually inspected, or the repairs might even start if it has been damaged. As one jet makes its way into position, things will be set up for the second one to land, which can be a tedious process if you have to repeat the process up to 90 times, depending on how many jets have been launched. It can easily take up to an hour for all these fighters to safely land back on the flight deck, and this is the moment the maintenance team dreads. Once everything is successfully retrieved to the carrier, maintenance operations will begin, with the aircraft all being whisked away for storage and awaiting the next mission. As we have previously mentioned, these aircraft are stored without any fuel, nor does it have any ordnance. So, maintenance staff will need to remove the ordnance that has not been used. It is one major operation when all aircraft are launched, especially in terms of getting them ready to repeat the same operation the next day. But with modern aircraft, things are a little bit different, and as we have already said, it is rare that a carrier strike group will operate by itself. For example, the United States has about 600 air tankers, which have all been optimized for aerial refueling. Should an Alpha strike be carried out from the Red Sea, it is very likely that these air tankers stationed at Diego Garcia military base will also be deployed to extend the mission. Yes, these tankers can keep the jets fully fueled to carry out repeated strikes if they have the ordnance to do so. It is a very useful asset to have considering the main purpose of the Boeing EA-18G Growler, which only jams the radar and communications of the enemy. Keeping it in the sky for as long as possible would inevitably assist other aerial assets in completing their missions without being impeded. Therefore, it also reduces the likelihood of an aircraft carrier ever carrying out an Alpha strike, especially since the US doesn't really want these carriers, which cost billions of dollars to come under any fire from the enemy. So, will the US ever carry out another Alpha strike? As of this video, it is unclear. Yes, the United States certainly has the capacity and experience to do something like this, but there are a lot of consequences to take into consideration. For example, launching such a large attack will almost certainly lead to a lot of damage, and this can be seen as a massive escalation in almost any conflict. As the world teeters on the edge of a possible nuclear war, every country is trying to de-escalate, or at least call for more de-escalation in specific conflicts. But we will give you an example of where such a strike might be useful in the current tension between Iran and Israel. If you were in the shoes of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, such a strike could be incredibly valuable to completely take down Iran. However, tensions from Iran have also been mounting, essentially meaning that Iran would double down on their ballistic missile launches that could theoretically hurt even more Israeli civilians. In terms of the United States, it is very unlikely they will ever use the Alpha strike again. As we mentioned, there is simply no need for such an overwhelming show of power when there are other, safer ways to do so. For example, a single sortie of 4 or 5 B-2 Spirit bombers, each carrying 2 GBU-57 bunker buster bombs, means that an enemy would face more than 300,000 pounds of explosive power, which is more than enough to wipe out an entire city. Moreover, the B-2 bombers are so advanced that enemy radar and interceptors wouldn't know what hit them until these bombers are safely clear of enemy airspace. This is a far better show of force and safer for those involved. It also eliminates the risk of something going wrong aboard an aircraft carrier. Perhaps if the United States must one day defend Taiwan from China, and aerial support is still a long way off, it might be useful to have the Alpha strike in the possible strike plans to down the massive naval fleet of China. Operation Linebacker 2 remains a testament to how versatile aircraft carriers can be, and exactly how much damage they can create when an Alpha strike is called. But doing so with a contingent of Growlers and Super Hornets will more than likely just wipe out an enemy entirely. So, for all intents and purposes, We don't believe that the only country capable of carrying out such a strike would ever use it unless it is absolutely necessary. But now, many of you might be wondering whether or not any nation has the capacity to defend itself from such an attack, and even if the United States will be able to stop something like this from happening. While there is no concise plan on how to defend from an alpha strike, it is very interesting to look at some of the possibilities. First, we will look at it from a Chinese point of view, before looking at it from the American side. The reason we are choosing China for this simulation is because it is the only country that could possibly try to resist almost 1,000 Growlers and Super Hornets heading in its direction. China currently operates 4 long-range defense systems. These are the HQ-9B, HQ-22, FK-3, HQ-16FE, and HQ-19, with a wealth of other short-range units that might be overwhelmed by the Alpha Strike if the long-range defenses fail. While the HQ-19 is certainly one of the most advanced, with the ability to intercept hypersonic missiles, it might also be overwhelmed, taking down only a handful of US fighters. But it is likely the combination of these 4, including radar technology and communication jammers, that would cause a lot of problems for the United States. In fact, the US might easily achieve its target, but it would not be without any consequences. At least a few dozen US fighters would be hit, causing serious damage and also affecting the global narrative. The US can mitigate this with the F-35, but these don't operate on aircraft carriers, which means the US will need to deploy them from bases around the South China Sea. Another threat is the fact that China could launch something similar, but targeting the US aircraft carrier, and if this falls, you have almost 100 fighters without a place to land. So, the United States might carry out such an attempt, but it will likely not target the Chinese mainland, and strikes will inevitably happen as far away from air defense sites as possible. But if the shoe is on the other foot, the damage could be even greater. China only operates 3 aircraft carriers, with 2 of them still being from the Soviet Union and having a ton of outdated technology. But the United States will likely be caught off guard, and this means that the first sortie might lead to a lot of damage. Keep in mind that we are not talking about striking the US mainland, as this is theoretically impossible, even before the United States even announced the idea of the Golden Dome. So, does this mean that an Alpha Strike is completely off the table? And if so, what will replace it? The modern era means the United States doesn't need to rely on the Alpha Strike to project power. In fact, ballistic missiles and drones are the latest form of warfare, and as Iran has shown, countries can now just send hundreds of ballistic missiles to achieve the same goal. While Iran still uses old technology, newer and more advanced radar-guided US missiles will achieve the exact same goal as an Alpha Strike. Moreover, bombers like the B-2 Spirit can also achieve the same level of damage, while dropping ordnance from thousands of feet in the sky. Nowadays, aircraft carriers play a vital role in conducting cyclic missions and sorties. For example, 4 Super Hornets could be deployed to take down a specific command post, and by the time they land, 4 more are in the sky to finish the job or take down a different target. So, as powerful as the Alpha Strike seems, and the level of power it can project, it is not something you're likely going to see in modern warfare. But we would love to see some of your comments, and we also want to know whether you would like to see such an impressive strike take place. Make sure that you are subscribed to our channel and let us know if you think China can perform an Alpha Strike on the USA.